I was saying that two things really. One is loneliness can be a happy fault, can be a way to awaken us to the fact that we need to be awakened. So loneliness is a design fault, I think, in the human condition, but it can be understood as a sign of a failed solitude. So we feel lonely, not because we don't have lots of friends, or we haven't got what we wanted, or we have problems with our relationships, or we have addictions, or whatever. We're not lonely really because of that in itself. We're lonely because we haven't learned how to be solitary. And it's a sign, therefore, that we have something to learn, and we learn it by starting from where we are, rather than just by imagining what we would like to be like or what we feel we should be like. So it's always about coming back, as Giovanni reminds us, with the body work that we're doing, it's always coming back to where we are and to where our natural center of gravity is in the present moment. And solitude is simply being the way we are, as Adam was after Eve appeared. He was lonely before Eve appeared, before the co-worker, the helper appeared. Nature wasn't enough. The animal kingdom wasn't enough. They needed to be alone together. But it wasn't very long before they got into trouble. And they must have had a sad moment when they discovered that one of their sons had killed another one of their sons. So life wasn't, blissful. But they were alone together. So human relationships are not themselves the cure for loneliness. If we seek to escape loneliness through any external means, even by projecting onto another person, real or imagined, we will eventually come back to the fault, to the default condition. We will eventually be disappointed again. We will be stuck in that cycle of death and rebirth. The healing of the Adamic condition, the human condition, is solitude. Solitude, which is our capacity for relationship. But if we don't have the solitude, the capacity to be solitary, then our capacity for relationship is very defective and may well condemn us or trap us in a cycle of repeated failures. And I think it does for longer or shorter periods of time for all of us. We learn through our mistakes. We learn by recognizing the pattern of our mistakes. So solitude is a different way of being alone. It's not the same as being lonely. In solitude, we are not alone in an isolated way. It doesn't mean that we are deprived of something or we don't focus. We may not have everything we want. Somebody you love dies, you don't have that aspect of their presence anymore. So you may not have everything you want. Nevertheless, the solitude is not focused upon your deprivation or what you've lost or what you don't have or what you've never had. All of that simply has to be accepted for what it is, for what is the way of you being who you are at that moment. It's about being, in other words, immersed in our own unique identity, and it is unique, frighteningly unique, and then accepting it wholeheartedly, not picking and choosing which parts of ourselves we would like or approve of or think that other people would approve of. We have to accept the whole package. There is fear in loneliness, and often that fear in loneliness develops anger, and sometimes that anger generates depression. But we can also be fearful of finding solitude. We can be frightened of being the unique being that we are. It can feel like a great cosmic loneliness, our uniqueness. And as we glimpse it or see it approaching, we can run away from it, just as we see it coming into sight. We confuse solitude with a worse form of loneliness. So we run away from it, we seek distraction, we seek consolation, false consolation, and then we start the process again. And that's part of our learning from mistakes. But it's also why, according to the cloud of unknowing, many people give up the work just at the moment that they are about to have a breakthrough. You just don't go that extra centimeter. You don't push over the horizon. There's a film that came out a few years ago called Gravity, and I think it was probably it had two famous stars in it, George Clooney and Sandra Bullock, but probably low cost because I don't think there were any other characters in it, and it was all set up in a space station. And there's a strong moment in the film where they are stranded up there, circling the Earth, and their space station has been hit by debris from something or other and very badly damaged. And so they're outside the spaceship in space, you know, trying to fix something. And I don't remember exactly what they're doing technically, but at some point, George Clooney realizes, or they realize, that he isn't going to be able to come back, and if she waits, then both of them will be lost. And so George Clooney, being George Clooney, smiles charmingly and says that he's going to cut himself free from the attachment, which would be mutually fatal. And so he goes flying off into space with a very nice smile. And then later in the film, where she's now on her own in the spaceship trying to get back to Earth, and again, something has gone wrong, and she's given up hope. And she thinks, well, I'm just going to be up here, just dying very slowly and miserably. So the best thing I can do is to turn off the oxygen and put myself out of my misery straight away. And at that moment, George Clooney smiles again. And he comes back. He's in the spaceship with her and tells her that, you know, this isn't what she should be doing. And he restores her hope and her will to live. And she finds some way of getting back to Earth. And of course, the second appearance of George Clooney's was a hallucination, but it had the desired effect. So in both of these moments where he sacrifices himself and flies off into outer space, and when he comes back in this imagined form, he is in a way representing the Bodhisattva ideal, which is that you put the welfare of others as your primary concern. Now, it's easier for George Clooney than for most of us. But I think that sort of brings it down to earth a little bit. He's acting like a bodhisattva, someone who dedicates himself to the welfare of others, even at the cost of his or her own life, or, as I was saying, their entry into nirvana. So this is reflected, and I'm sure if you think about it, you will be able to identify many bodhisattva moments in your own life, maybe even moments where you have been a bit of a bodhisattva yourself, at least for a moment, or where you have benefited by seeing it in others or being the recipient of that kind of concern. And once you know what to look for, you see it more often in the world than you think. I think that moment last week, I think it was, when the young African from Mali climbed up like Spider-Man, you remember? Up 5 floors. This amazing phenomenon, if you see it, to rescue a child who was hanging on by his fingers. And as it often seems to be the case in such incidents, the hero who does this didn't think about it. And when he was talking to President Macron, who gave him French citizenship as a reward, he just said, you know, well, actually, he did say he didn't think about it initially, and then he prayed for God's help. Don't know what President Macron thought about that, but for this young man, it was clearly where he found the strength to sustain that generosity, that concern for the welfare of that child. So once you know what to look for and can recognize it, you know, human beings aren't as bad as they look and not as bad as the news generally tends to present us. But this is reflected, of course, it's reflected in the gospel, in the whole meaning of Christ. But here is St. Paul, who was not a perfect person. This is, I think, reflected in what he says here. He's writing to the Philippians. These letters are all about his concern for the well-being of these little fledgling communities that he has helped to start, which are all struggling and having conflicts and problems. And he says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. So in other words, he's found Christ. He'd be quite happy to move on now, to die. But if to live in the flesh is my lot, this means for me fruitful labor, and I do not know which to choose. So I'd be quite happy dying and going into Christ fully, but staying in this life and doing fruitful work for others is also a choice, and I don't know which of these two options to choose. Indeed, I am hard-pressed from both sides. He's caught in this, desiring to depart and to be with Christ, which is better, he says, a lot farther better, but to stay on in the flesh is necessary for your sake. And with this conviction, I know that I shall stay on and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, that your rejoicing in my regard may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. So you'll be very happy to see me again when I come to visit. So I think that expresses something, again, of this Bodhisattva ideal, putting your concern for the welfare of others before your own immediate advantage or pleasure or attraction. As the attention comes off ourselves, and as we stop thinking about our right to pursue happiness, we begin to encounter our solitude, our true self, our unique self. In pursuing our happiness, in defending our right to be happy, we lose it. We get stuck in the self-fixated state. Ramana Maharshi, great Indian sage of the last century, who at a very young age had realized himself, or became a realized being, as I think many children do, for brief moments, or periods of time perhaps. A child, I think, does know what it is to be awakened, to have an awakened mind at the stage of development they're at. But in his case, very unusually, he remained in this awakened state for the rest of his life. It took him a good 10 years to sort of integrate it in solitude, and then he just stayed awakened and poured out this the grace, really, of his state to others. He didn't set up any institution. He didn't initiate any disciples. Didn't tell people what to do. He just sat. Occasionally he did reply to questions, but basically he worked by his presence. He was once asked by somebody, you're sitting here in Tamil Nadu, and people come from all over the world to see you, but why don't you go traveling all around the world and bring this grace to, to people who can't come here? And his reply was, how do you know that I don't? So Ramana says that speaking of self-realization is a delusion. Speaking about self-realization is itself a delusion. It's a delusion that may have some value, temporary value, in order to get rid of another delusion, which is the delusion that the non-self is the self, or that the unreal is the real. And we need to wean ourselves off that delusion by the idea that we should be realized. But as he says, the self is always the self, and there is no such thing as realizing it. It's a little similar to what the Buddha, how the Buddha responded when he was asked at the end of his life, after all these years of meditation, what have you gained? And he said, nothing. They said, oh dear. And he replied, but I've lost a lot. In St. Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be put to death, and on the third day rise again. And Peter, taking him aside, began to chide him, saying, this must not happen, Lord. This will never happen to you. And Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Satan meaning a stumbling block. Because you are a scandal to me, because you think and you're not aware of the things of God, but you're thinking in human terms. So Jesus is warning them, or trying to help them to awaken to what his meaning is, that he will be going to Jerusalem and dying there. And they don't like that idea. And then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, let that person leave themselves behind, take up their cross, and follow me. Because whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And what does it profit anyone if they gain the whole world but suffer the loss of their own soul? And what will anyone give in exchange for their soul, for their self, their true self? So, this idea of leaving self behind can easily, wrongly be misinterpreted as, and sometimes it's translated as, self-denial. Well, that might also be misinterpreted as self-harm. Or taking up your cross every day means that if life doesn't crucify you that day, then you must crucify yourself. And the more we suffer, the closer we will come to God. That is a very, in many traditions actually, but we certainly can be be aware of that as a misinterpretation, a severe misinterpretation of the meaning of these words. In fact, what Jesus is describing, it comes much closer to what the Buddha meant when he says that it is possible for us to escape suffering. The first noble truth is that there is suffering in the world, and you can't avoid the fact that there is suffering in the world, such as loneliness. But equally true is the fact that there is a way beyond it. And Jesus is, in his own terms, describing exactly this. And it's why Jesus says in another passage that to take refuge in him, to follow him, or to come to him, uses different expressions, you will then find that the yoke that you have to carry, the relationship, is a light one. It's not as burdensome, and the weight you have to carry of that commitment is much lighter than you imagine it's going to be. My yoke is easy and my burden light. It's not as bad as it looks before you take the plunge, before you take refuge, before you start to follow. And that taking refuge, that following, that being a disciple, is the way in which, in some form or other, we take the second step and get on the way. Rather than just wanting it, we actually do something about it. But we may tremble on that brink of commitment for all sorts of reasons, and the ego certainly resists it until we sort of slip over into it. So we need to want this state of mind, we need to want to be free, we need to want to move on out of the state we're in, but we also need to start to activate it. We actually need to be on the way. And then very quickly, we confront our own self-generated obstacles. So it isn't that this is the arrival point, this is the departure point. And just as when you get on a train or you start a long plane trip with different connections, you can get, I got to Poitiers, I was in Bonvaux just before coming here, and got up very early in the morning to go to Poitiers to get on the train, and then discovered the French rail strike had cancelled that train. You know? Well, I made it, but it was a bit frustrating, but I was on the way. I didn't give up and go back. So there will be obstacles, diversions, upsets on the way, but more important than those is to be prepared for them and not to give up. As the old rabbi once said, God does not expect us to succeed, but we are not allowed to give up.